Hello guys, and welcome to this new chapter where we'll be discussing human anatomy, hair, clothes, materials, expressions, and posing. For this particular chapter, I do want to point out a few things before starting. As I've mentioned before, I'm a self-taught artist, and a lot of what I've learned has been from trial and error, so I can't really speak as an authority regarding best ways and practices to learn fundamentals like anatomy. Then again, I don't think anything in drawing is really black and white, so my advice will be more or less valid to you depending on your own background and interpretation. I'm here to tell you about how I've learned things and what goes through my mind when drawing in order to keep things reasonable and consistent. With that out of the way, I'm going to jump right into this particular subchapter, anatomy. I'll start this by telling you a little story about my own encounters with the subject. You see, I've always had good observation and spatial skills, so even as a kid I was able to reproduce shapes from photography and other drawings with relative ease. I just look at them, understand what the subject was, and copy it as I saw it. In my teens, I also drew a lot of acrobatic gymnasts from photos since I was involved in the sport myself, and I became kind of confident that I knew anatomy pretty well. After all, you do need a good understanding of it to depict extreme poses and highly muscular athletes. Or so I thought. In late 2016, I participated in a workshop in 3D sculpting by Scott Eaton, where he went very into detail on aspects of facial anatomy. One of the first things he asked participants to do was sketch a human skull from memory with no references. I thought I knew what a skull looked like. I mean, everyone knows what a skull looks like, right? Well, as it turned out, I most definitely did not. I knew where the eye sockets should be, and a little triangle for the nose and the teeth, but everything else was a blur, and the skull I ended up with looked very uncanny, kind of like a prop from a Halloween party. Out of curiosity, I want to prompt you to pause the video and try to sketch a skull yourself without references, as accurately as you can. Got it? Let's move on to my screen then. I've structured these classes in a vertical format since I'm very familiar with it, and each part will have its own little panel. Everything is pre-drawn by me, so no recorded drawing for now, but that's mostly because having things pre-organized helps me create these with less trouble. First panel is our little skull body, so you can compare your sketch against this if you went through with it. Did you get it right? If you did, you probably won't gain anything new from this specific part of the course, but chances are you weren't fully familiar with the skull. My point in doing this is to try and convince you that in order to learn how to draw anatomy, you should consider learning anatomy itself, and you, just like me, probably still have a long way to go. The pictures in the next panel come from a poster I created in 2017 as part of an assignment for my master's degree, where we needed to research a specific topic in the area of 3D animation. Since I've always been interested in 3D character sculpting, the theme I picked was 3D character customization, and what a custom character creator might look like if, instead of adjusting individual shape sliders, you could adjust more functional ones, like those related to lifestyle, ancestry, etc., etc. In order to do this, I did some research into human anatomy, and in particular what gives it shape, and in what ways depending on the person. Character customization aside, it's a fairly detailed map of the main parts of our musculoskeletal system and how it changes shape depending on factors like age, race, lifestyle, etc. So I thought it'd be a good idea to share it with you if anyone's interested in a more in-depth look at the human body. Now, personally, I'm not an expert in anatomy yet, nowhere near it. And although I've got a good grip on it, I'm still at a loss when it comes to certain muscles and angles, and still frequently look at medical illustrations to try and understand what someone's back or arm should look like in a certain position. To me, and maybe to some of you too, more important than knowing what it looks like on the surface is understanding why it looks the way it looks and what's going on underneath the skin to affect it, even if only to a certain extent. This little panel here is just to remind you to keep this in mind. I won't go through the different muscles or bones with you in this course, but the attached poster and online resources such as 3D models and medical illustrations might help you as you go along if you ever feel like you don't really understand why a pose looks the way it does. For the sake of exemplifying this a bit, let's focus on this couple of skeletons here. On the right, you can see a biologically male skeleton compared to a female one. Female bodies tend to have wider hips adapted to childbearing, and so their centers of gravity are lower than the males. It may also cause their legs to be more X-shaped, as you can see here. Female skeletons also tend to have smaller rib cages, giving the illusion of narrower shoulders than the average male skeleton, which isn't necessarily true. Details like these might seem inconsequential, but even if you have a more stylized art style, I think there's value in expanding your knowledge on anatomy to this level in order to best design and draw characters. Moving on, let's see how to apply this knowledge to drawing, or how to transition from studying the skull to drawing a face. I've got some references here, and although I've personally done little more than gymnast drawings for fun as a means of properly practicing and studying anatomy, I think it might be an interesting exercise to take these and apply what we know about the musculoskeletal system to them. Drawing bones or muscles over actual photographs can help you understand them better and develop this mindset of knowing what's underneath rather than just a superficial shape. In hands, for instance, it's very easy to see which bones are where just by looking at them. If you've got hands yourself, you can move your fingers around and see what they look like and what they feel like for yourself, and how they twist and bend as well. When I think about drawing a hand like this one, I'm thinking about the bones underneath, or even ligaments and veins over those. Same thing with muscles. When the model of the photograph is very athletic, it's very easy to see all the different muscles and how they connect. Drawing over these doesn't necessarily have to be anatomically correct in my opinion, as long as you're able to distinguish different main groups and shapes. Same thing for faces. Although the face has a lot of muscles, the main shape-defining thing for me is the skull, and as a thought exercise I like to imagine what the skull would look like in specific pictures or even drawings. If an art style can accommodate some type of believable skull underneath its faces, that tells me that the artist has a good grip on anatomy, or at least enough to be comfortable with it. The next step after understanding a bit more about the human body is to look for ways to simplify it. I've got 3 stages in this panel. The first one is just a skeleton. Looking at it, I think about which parts bend, rotate, are static, etc. Based on this criteria, I isolate the ribcage, the skull and the hip bones, the main bending points or joints, and the bones that connect them. Feet and hands count as static parts too for the effects of this study. These are my main building blocks, as you can see here. This isn't really a process I repeat every time I draw, but it's a decent enough approximation of how things play out in my head. The next step for me would be to block out muscles with very straight lines. I've seen some people use circles and curves to do similar things, but to me it just makes more sense that they're more like roughly carved parts. Keeping surfaces flat gives me a better idea of shape than curve approximations, especially when things like muscles are often connected between 2 points and stretched out. So these are the 3 stages through which I simplify what I know about anatomy and whatnot. In terms of proportions, in my opinion, it comes with practice and observation. Many people know about the head size thing for figuring out human proportions, but I think it's a very restrictive way to think about it. If you practice thinking about the subject of your drawings in 3D in your head, you'll eventually naturally learn how long or short things should be, the same way you learn where eyes and ears should go, etc. If you ever struggle with it, using reference pictures or even yourself as a reference should be your go-to, while the knowledge isn't there yet. These are ideas that I'm giving you to practice at will, or at least keep in mind. Simplify a sexy skeleton, draw over people in photos, etc. Now I want to add some things on the subject of referencing and figure drawing. I've personally only done life drawing 2 or 3 times, more in the context of socializing than learning, so I never really got much from it. As I said earlier in this video, drawing gymnasts was what cut it for me in terms of anatomy practice, and it's a lot of fun. Extreme poses are very satisfying for me to draw, especially things that involve perspective angles and back bends. Not only are the models in these pictures often extremely slender and athletic, allowing me to see their musculature very clearly, but they're also defying gravity or pushing flexibility and strength to extremes, which forces me to try to understand exactly how the pose came to be before venturing into drawing it. Now, I'm not saying drawing gymnasts is better than drawing from any other type of reference photo. I think a healthy mix of different types of bodies and poses is a better bet. My point is more that drawing extreme poses forced me to think about them more. I've seen people struggle with life drawing or using references because they're not used to doing this. They tend to think about reference in terms of its shape or outline, and not the actual core of the pose. Saying things like, I can't use this reference because it's not the right body type for this character, when referring to a pose reference, is a clear example of this. Note that it's perfectly valid to match the body type of your reference to the one of the character you want to draw if what you're referencing is intrinsically connected to that specific body type. However, if it's just the pose you're looking at, you should be able to reference it from anyone or anything posed that way. My main advice in this aspect is to step out of your comfort zone and try out some extreme pose referencing from sports or circus performances, for instance. And try to cultivate this mindset of looking at the mechanics behind the pose and not just what it looks like from the outside. To illustrate this briefly, I've got a couple of dancers/gymnasts here. I've blocked both of them differently, and the main reason for that is that in the first one I was looking at the muscle structure more, as it's very clearly lit and shown in the photo. The second one has a somewhat extreme back bend, so I use that to do the static versus flexible parts type of blocking from earlier. As you can see, even with this angle of bending, the ribcage and the hips don't change form. It's the spine and the joints doing most of the work. Ribs do become wider apart in this sort of pose, but they don't fundamentally change shape. To close off, a note on 3D planes. All of what I've mentioned are ways of thinking about and observing things. Essentially, I'm trying to get you to think in terms of 3D shapes you can project on the paper. During my degree in 3D animation, I realized that actual 3D sculpting helped me improve my anatomy skills as well. When you actually have to work in a 3D environment, what you sculpt is directly reflected in all directions, and you gain a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work and why. If you have access to a 3D sculpting or modeling software, I recommend that you play around with something that looks roughly like a face or a body to get a better grip on what a turnaround looks like. Now, 3D planes. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's more of a side note and an interesting take on art for me than a fundamental thing. If you look up face planes drawing or body planes drawing, you'll see a specific type of drawing that basically turns parts of the body into 3D planes that normally be rounder or softer surfaces. It simplifies shapes that could otherwise look too ambiguous to understand at first and makes it clear what the blocks of the body are. You can see how I roughly blocked both these pictures with 3D planes. Images with harsh lighting make it particularly easy, and it's a great fun exercise to try out. With faces in particular, blocking 3D planes can help you understand how the different parts fit together and take shape. Some of it might even translate directly into your style, as is the case with mine. Furthermore, once you've got a good grip on these face blocks, it's easy to isolate and tweak them to give your characters distinct shapes and features. So that's another exercise I'd recommend to you. Lastly, just a brief nod to stylizing from real pictures, or working on making stylized ones more consistent with realism in general. Breaking anatomy doesn't necessarily equate to good stylized art, as most of you should know. And an interesting exercise to add to your study list if you happen to prefer highly stylized drawings or already have such a style on your own is trying to reference from real pictures while maintaining your style. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of value in conceptualizing what your stylized skulls and anatomy would look like under the skin too, so you know how they work and what they would look like in different angles and positions. Again, just a suggestion and food for thought at the end of this lesson. This is essentially the thought process behind how I draw anatomy and some tips on how you can improve your own. If you don't feel like you're at a good level with anatomy yet, don't feel rushed to improve now. This course is meant to give you the tools and not train you per se. So you can still take it at your own pace, keep these things in mind, and take as much as possible from the remainder of it in other areas that I'll brush over. Next video, we'll be looking at hair, clothes, and materials. See you then!